Okay, today's stuff we're going to be learning is Yoma Daf Mem. We're going to start at the fourth line, but I want to review a little bit where we ended yesterday. We saw Machloket Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan. This is very important because it's going to take us throughout the daf today. We saw a Machloket between them, whether everyone agrees that placing the lots on top of the animals after they already drew the lots is not essential. Lo ma'akva, right? That means if it's not done, everything's fine. But there's a debate between them. Rabbi Yanai says, taking the goral out of the kalpi and drawing the lots basically is essential. If you don't do that, it's disqualified, right? You have to start again. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Then we had two lishonot, as they say, about how to understand this. Are they debating according to Rabbi Yehuda or according to Rabbi Nechemia? Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia have this debate. If you wear, when the Kohen Gadol is wearing the white clothing, so according to Rabbi Nechemia, everything he does on the white clothing, meaning all the avodat Yom Kippurim, is ma'akev, meaning has to be done exactly that way. According to Rabbi Yochanan, no, if he didn't do things, the only essential parts of his avodah are the ones done inside the Kodesh Kodeshim. Today we'll go through a whole list of what the Kohen does and in what order, and we'll see some of it was done inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, which is basically sprinkling the blood inside of the kaporet and of the dam, of the par and of the seir, right? Both the bull and the goat. And also he did the k'choret, the incense burning. Everything else, which there's a bunch of blood sprinklings that are done outside, and let's say the hagrala is done outside, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's not ma'akev. So according to the first reading, everybody agrees with Rabbi Yehuda. It's not, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even Rabbi Yanai agrees that it's not ma'akev. It's okay if you don't do it, because that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. And the machloket is according to Rabbi Nechemia. When he says it is ma'akev, would that include the hagrala or not? Is the hagrala avodah? Or is it maybe he means all the sprinklings of the blood and the slaughtering, the main parts? But this is not a main part. This is just kind of a prep, right? It's a pre. But according to the second reading, and that's the one we're going to focus on, even Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yana, even Rabbi Yehuda thinks that it's ma'akev, and that's because even though nothing else that's done outside, the sprinkling of the blood, any of that stuff, even though that's not ma'akev, specifically the goral is ma'akev, the hagrala. The hagrala is critical, okay? It's an essential part of the service. How do we know? Because it says asher Allah 2 times. That makes it essential. Now, before we even go, so basically we're going to focus on, and then the machloket between them is according to Rabbi Yana, okay? Then, according to Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Nechemia says everything's ma'akev, then Rabbi Yana will say, Rabbi Yana will say, that's Rabbi Nechemia. And Rabbi Yochanan will say, oh no, like we said before, this isn't avoda, everything else is ma'akev, but not this. This is not essential. So you have two different approaches, right? Is the hagrala critical? Is that the main part, or is it not so significant at all? Since this is our topic for today, we're going to be very technical about it, okay? We're going to bring different sources. We're going to basically have a number of sources to try to reject this opinion of Rabbi Yanai, according to Rabbi Yehuda. That basically what we end up saying, according to the second reading, is that according to Rabbi Yanai, everyone thinks hagrala is ma'akev. Also Rabbi Yehuda, also Rabbi Nechemia. It's going to come out different, right? So that basically he thinks they all say that's the case. And we're going to bring a bunch of sources that seem to say, like we saw yesterday, but the first one sounds like hagrala isn't ma'akev, okay? Isn't ma'akev, it's not essential. And then each time we're going to have to say, how will Rabbi Yanai read this? Because according to him, everybody thinks it is. So we'll get to that. But before we get to that, I want to read a very interesting source in Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch when he talks about the hagrala in general, this idea of the seir la'Hashem and the seir la'Azazel. Okay, we're going to see later in Yoma that on Samach Gimel, I think, that they take 2 seirim and they that are exactly, they look the same, their height is the same, they're exactly identical. So here, I'm going to read it in Hebrew and translate as I read. It's a very beautiful source. It's Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in his commentary on the Torah, on Vayikra Tet Zayin Yud. Okay, if you want to read it inside, it's on the sheet. Shnei seirim hamurim kan, the 2 goats that we're discussing here, mita'arim lefanenu shtei dmuyot. They represent for us 2 personalities, 2 images. In the beginning, they both have the same purpose. If they go into the temple, and each one could equally be chosen for Hashem or for Azazel. And only once they get into the temple do their paths split. As it says in Yoma, that both have to look the same height, same blood. I don't know exactly what that means. And they're bought exactly at the same time. They both stand equally in front of the Baal Moed. They're both about to the same decision, the different decision about each, but again, they're all they both have both options equally available to them. Whether it's to God or whether it's to Azazel. They could each be one, right? He's repeating the same thing in many different words. They could be that way because they could be the other way. It's a very interesting line, and he quotes this Gemara in Samach Gimel, Ein hagoral koveh ela bero'eh l'Hashem. In other words, it can only be an animal that could be potentially slaughtered to God. It's very dramatic, his source. Right, from then on, though, their paths split, and then they obviously each go in opposite direction. One goes to God and one goes to Azazel. We know Azazel is a word for hell, right? It's not exactly hell here, but it's basically going to get all the sins of the people put on it. So he says, here's his real clincher. Each one of us is like the goat. Each one of us has the power to go against, right? To basically make a decision. Anything that's working against you, right? You have the power to go against it. You can go against your evil inclination. What he's really saying is we can go against the Yetzer Hara, we can go against God. Okay, we can do whatever it is we want to do, right? It's all a matter of how we use that power that we have. We can do it to what God wants. Right? All the different things that distract us. We have the power to overcome that. We can also decide we're going to go against what God says. In other words, God gave us that power, but he gave us the power to decide on our own. Okay, and it basically goes on. We can stop here. But that's basically the idea here of the Goral. So it's all about we have the power to choose which way to go. And that's what the Goral, that's what the Shiur and the Goral symbolizes. That's why in the end, could be, right? Again, this is his reading, but that's why this is why the Goral is so essential, according to Rabbi Yana. Because again, this goes back to what we've been talking about. It's not all about what happens in the temple, right? It's a metaphor for us and what we can take from this. And what we can take from this is the idea about us having the power to choose, and that our paths, right? We have two equal paths, right? Two very unequal paths, but the opportunity to do each one in an equal manner. And it's up to us to decide where we want to go. So it's a very nice image to think about before we leap into our very technical daf. Tashma. Okay, so now we're going to bring our second source. We started with the source yesterday. I should just review very briefly because it's going to lead into what we're going to say right now, which is we brought a source that seemed to say very clearly, mitzvah lahagril, it's a mitzvah to do it, but im lo higril kasher, but if you didn't do it, it's okay. That sounds very clear. Against Rabbi Yana, you said everyone holds it's ma'akeh, to which we basically said, oh, just change the words. It didn't mean mitzvah lahagril, it meant mitzvah lahaniach, to put the lots on the animals. Even Rabbi Yana agreed that that wasn't essential, and therefore we reread that source explaining it that way. Why did I want to start with this? Because number one, to review. Number two, it's going to be the same. They're going to try to answer the next source in the same way, but they're not going to be able to. And then they're going to say, and therefore we have a question. Tashma, let's learn from this source. Mitzvah lahagril ulehitvadot. Okay, this one says you have to do a hagrala, the lotteries, the drawing the lots, ulehitvadot, and you must do it's a mitzvah to confess, right? You confess the sins on the Shiur Lazazel, right? He does a confession on them. Lo higril velo hitvadeh kasher, but if you didn't do either of those, it's not essential. Now, if you want to say v'chitema hachinami lahaniach, maybe this didn't mean lahagril, it meant to place the lots on the animals, but the hagrala is essential, as Rabbi Yanai says, can't work for this source. Why? Because of the continuation. Ema Seifa, it says in the continuation, Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo higril kasher, lo hitvadeh pasul. Rabbi Shimon agrees with the first point. The hagrala is not essential. But he disagrees with the vidoy, and he says, but you must confess. Confession is essential. If the Kohen didn't do the confession, it doesn't work. Remember, there's 3 confessions, 2 on the bulls, and then 1 on the seir. So if you didn't do the vidoy on the goat, it doesn't work. The first one is up for the Kohen and his family. The second is for the Kohen and his family and all the Kohanim. And the third one is for all of the people. So now, if you want to say my lohi gril really means ilema lohi niach, if you want to say it means you don't have to place them, but not that you don't have to do the hagrala. Michlal de Rabbi Shimon Savar hagrala ma'akva. If you're going to say that the source is basically telling you that placing it is not essential, that means that placing the lots is not essential, but doing the drawing of the lots itself is essential because, right, if drawing the lots isn't essential, then you certainly don't need to see placing the lots is not essential. So if you're saying placing the lots is not essential, that assumes that you mean the hagrala is essential. Now, why can't you say this? We're going to have to then say, both Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, the only thing they disagree about is the vidoy, the confession. Rabbi Shimon says the vidoy is essential. Rabbis say it isn't. Now, if we're going to try to replace the word hagrala with the word hanacha, it's going to be clear that both Tanna Kama and Rabbi Shimon say hagrala is essential, which would then fit in with Rabbi Yanai, but we can't say that because why not? Because the idea here being is both of them agree about hagrala, which means, and if we move the word hagrala and switch it with hanacha, both of them agree about hanacha, that it's not essential, which means that they both agree that hagrala is essential. So if that's the case, can't be that Rabbi Shimon, maybe Tanna Kama holds that way, but Rabbi Shimon definitely can't hold that hagrala is essential. Why not? The Hatanya, it says in a Braita, mate echad mehem. What if one of the seirim dies? Mevi chavero shelo b'hagrala. We just bring another one. There's a whole debate about this. We'll get to it later. But according to Rabbi Shimon, you just bring a hagrala, and you just bring a goat, and you don't do hagrala. In other words, let's say the Shiur Lazazel dies. You already have the Shiur Lashem. You bring another goat and say this one will be for Azazel. Now, if that's the case, that you can just replace it without doing a hagrala on it, without drawing any lot on it, then it shows that drawing lots is not essential. So now, Divrei Rabbi Shimon. So which means that Rabbi Shimon holds drawing lots is not essential. So you can't switch the words with hagrala. You have to understand Rabbi Shimon literally. Okay, I see a question that came up, so I want to just address it to make sure this is clear. It's very important to understand this. How can hagrala not be essential if it says so in the Torah? So that's what we saw yesterday, that even though it says things in the Torah, and there's a whole rule about kudshim, and it talks about, we're going to learn this a lot more when we get to Zvachim, we have a long time to get there, but there's always a debate. Yes, it says you're supposed to do A, B, C, D, and E, but who's to say that everything has to be done exactly that way? Maybe that's the ideal way, but you don't necessarily have to do it that way. And the rule of thumb when it comes to the temple is if something is repeated, that means it's absolutely essential. If it doesn't repeat it, then it's not necessarily essential. So that's why they said here, according to one opinion, that because it says asher Allah, that shows this is essential, even though maybe other things aren't. Right? That's the whole debate. The whole debate here is, do we view this as essential? And that's the whole question. Once you read Rav Shem Raphael Hirsch, you kind of say, this sounds pretty central, but you don't necessarily have to go by his opinion. And he's trying to explain the opinion that it is essential. But there are those who think that it's not essential because it's just a way of choosing. And maybe you could choose some other way. Yeah, it's the way God wanted it. But if you did it some other way, it would still work, right? Imagine you did all the Avodat Yom Kippurim, you did the sprinkling of the blood, you did, right? Those are the major things. You did the vidoy, you did the confession. I mean, even here you see confession maybe isn't critical. But if you hold by Rabbi Shimon, the confession is critical, you do that. and you just happen to choose which one's going to go to God. Okay, so you missed that part of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end all be all and has to be that way just because it says so in the Torah. So again, things are said in the Torah, but it's not necessarily that you can't do it some other way. That's really the whole debate of the sugya. So now that's why I wanted to go back, because I see if there's a question, I want to make sure that that's totally clear. So now we basically have a problem, because you can't say that Rabbi Shimon thinks that Hagrala is not essential, because he says you have to, right? He says you can't assume he thinks it's essential, because he clearly says if one dies, you bring the other one, even though it never went through any lottery process, it's fine. So therefore, he must hold that Hagrala is not essential, which means you can't fill in the word hanacha. He says hanacha is not essential, because again, as soon as you say hanacha is not essential, that presumes that you mean Hagrala is, hanacha is not. So they're going to now try to, and that basically questions, because now this whole source seems to indicate both Tanna Kama and Rabbi Shimon think that Hagrala is not essential. So how are we going to understand this braita? So now we're going to say the following. It's true that Rabbi Shimon thinks Hagrala is not essential, but we're going to try to prove that Tanna Kama thinks it is. And the way we're going to do that, until now we said, well, if Rabbi Shimon means, if Hagrala means hanacha, then also Tanna Kama, Hagrala means hanacha. But now we're going to say no, not necessarily. Rabbi Shimon lo yada mai ka'amrei Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon actually didn't know. When the rabbi said Hagrala is ma'akva, did they mean Hagrala or did they mean hanacha? He didn't know. And he said to them the following. So now his reaction is going to be a two possibility reaction. What he's saying to them is the following. Hachi ka'amar lehu. This is what he said to them. Hagrala mamash kamaritu. If when you said Hagrala is a mitzvah, but if you didn't do it, it's okay. Well, if you meant Hagrala, then pligna alaychu b'chad. Then I only disagree with you about one thing. Meaning, you think Hagrala is not essential. I agree with you about that. I disagree with you about the vidoy. Confession, you say, is not essential. I think it is. But Hagrala ka'amaritu hainu hanacha, which is basically what we want to claim. He says, if what you meant is really hanacha, which means you think Hagrala is essential, well, guess what then? I'm going to disagree with you on two counts. Number one, I don't think Hagrala is essential. Number two, I think that vidoy is essential. So then he's going to disagree with them on two counts. So in the end, what we can say is that the rabbis do think Hagrala is, I'm sorry, did I say it? Yeah. The rabbis do think that they were really talking about hanacha, which then fits in with Rabbi Yana. Tanna Kama holds, or the rabbis hold, whatever you call them, the first opinion here holds that Hagrala is essential. Vidoy is not essential. And Rabbi Shimon holds exactly the opposite. Confession is essential. Hagrala isn't. Now you might say it's a very interesting, they have a total flip, but it actually makes sense because the question is, what's more important? Is the drawing the lots more significant or is the confession more significant? And then we have a way of saying that according to Tanna Kama, Hagrala is essential, and that fits the second lashon of Rabbi Yana, that everyone holds that way, everyone being Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Obviously, Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold that way because he explicitly says so. And, there's only one way to understand him. So basically, Rabbi Shimon is going to be some other approach, but that's not what Rabbi Yana was referring to. He was referring to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia and their machloket about the Bigdei Lavan and things you do bachutz. Are they essential? Are they ma'akev or not? And even according to both of them, and whatever the machloket is, we're still going to say they both hold that it's essential, the Hagrala. Second source for today, third question in general on Tashma. Par ma'akevet ha'se'ir v'se'ir em ma'akevet ha'pal. Okay, b'matanot shebifnim. What does this mean? So let's just read for a minute. Bishlama par ma'akevet ha'se'ir. What does that mean? Di'atime l'se'ir makame par lo ave v'lo klum. What it means that par is ma'akevet ha'se'ir, it means the order is essential of the activities. That if you do the par, you do the se'ir before the par, doesn't work. Now, what does this mean? So for the sake of making things clear, I wrote on the sheet a bunch of the activities. There's a few missing here, but basically a bunch of the activities of the par and se'ir on Yom Kippur. So we start off number one. The vidoy of the Kohen Gadol, we saw this already. The Kohen Gadol does the confession on the bull. Remember, he brings the bull, bein ulam lemizbech, he does the confession. Then we do the Hagrala. That's exactly where we're up to in the Mishnayot. So we haven't gotten to numbers 3 through 10 yet. After he does the hagrala for the seirim, he goes back to the par. We'll see this tomorrow. And he does the vidoy on the par, right? He first did the confession for himself and his family. Now he does the second confession on the par, and he slaughters the par. Then he brings in the kaf and the machta. Remember the coal pan and the incense into the kodesh kodeshim, and he burns it up, makes a smoke there. Then he sprinkles the dam hapar in the kodesh kodeshim. He goes inside the kodesh kodeshim with the blood of the bull, and he sprinkles it on the kaporet, on the aron. Then he slaughters the seir. Okay, then he sprinkles the blood of the seir. So now he gets to the goat. Notice always the par always goes before the goat, and this is what we're going to discuss. So what we're saying is the par has to go before the seir in the matanot shebifnim. What are matanot shebifnim? It means the placings of the blood inside the kodesh kodeshim. So that's what we're up to right now. First, number 5 was you sprinkle the blood of the par. Number 7 was you sprinkle the blood of the seir inside. Then you're done with that. So that clearly means number 7 can't precede number 5. First, you have to sprinkle the blood of the par, the bull inside. Then you sprinkle the blood of the seir inside. Then we keep going on. Let's just read the last 3 activities, because these are going to be important for the continuation of the discussion. Then you go outside the kodesh kodeshim. You take the blood of the par and you sprinkle it toward the parochet, which separates between the hechal and the kodesh kodeshim, the holy of holies. Then you take the blood of the seir and you sprinkle it toward, again, par comes before seir. Then finally you mix the 2 bloods, which we've seen a whole bunch of times about min b'mino and whether it's batel. We don't know that all from here. Anyway, we'll get into that another time. You mix the 2 bloods, and then you put all the bloods on the mizbeach haktoret, which sits inside the hechal. You put it on the corners of that altar. Those are the 10 actions that we're going to discuss. It also helps you on the sheet. I made references to the numbers as we go on in this discussion. It's a little bit confusing. So what does it mean? We have 2 sentences now. The par is ma'akevet ha'seir. That means if you do it in the wrong order, it's a problem. But the seir is not ma'akevet ha'pal. But you can do something of the seir before the par. Okay, we're going to have to figure out what can you do, because we just said you can't do it out of order. Something can be done out of order and something can't be done out of order. And it also says in that braita, b'matanot shebifnim, which sounds like they're referring exclusively to the sprinklings of the blood inside. So this isn't going to make much sense, because we're now going to say, so bishlama par ma'akevet ha'seir, that line we totally get. When it comes to the sprinklings inside the kodesh kodeshim, if you do number 7 before number 5, you sprinkle the blood of the goat inside kodesh kodeshim on the kaporet before you do the blood of the seir, before you do the blood of the par. Lo aviv lo klum. If you do the goat before the bull, it's useless. You have to start again. But what does it mean that you can do something of the seir before you do the par? Meaning, if you did it out of order, it's okay. So, ilema de'akti matnot par behechal mikame matnot seir bifnim. If you want to say that you did the par now we're going to have something that's out of order. So you did the par inside before you did the matanot of the seir. Sorry, did I say you did the par in the hechal, in the sanctuary, before you did the matanot of the seir bifnim? Meaning, okay, what happened after you did, right? You did the bull, then you did the seir inside, but instead of doing the seir inside where you were supposed to, first you then did the bull outside. You went into the hechal and you sprinkled toward the parochet. After you did that, you did the seir. That's what it means. Seir ein ma'akevet par. That's what they're suggesting. That if you did, meaning the par first before the seir of inside, you did before you did the seir inside, you did the par outside, that would be okay. Well, you can't do that because chukaktiv behu. Because at the end of the whole section, this is a little difficult to what I answered to the question before, because here it says at the end of the section in the Torah of this whole part in Pasuk Kaf Tet, it says, "Vaytalachem chukat olam b'chodesh hashvi." This should be for you chukat olam. This is a chukah. This has to be done exactly as we described, which means that the order is essential, which means you can't do it out of order. So therefore, they say it can't be that you can switch the order of 8 and 7, not possible. What it means is, if you did the bull that was inside, meaning the sprinkling of the blood before you did number 5, before you did number 2. You took the bull, you did the vidoy, then you slaughtered it, and then you brought the blood inside, and only after did you start setting up the serum. Now that would be logical because it doesn't, right? When you do the hagrala, we only do the hagrala in the seer, and then we ignore the seer and we go back to the bull. So theoretically, if you started the order and you did your 2 confessions on the bull, and then you did the sprinkling of the bull inside, and then you start with the serum, maybe that's what it means. Now, if we assume that's what it means, now here comes a big jump. They're going to say the following. Misidra lo ma'akva, ikara hagrala nami lo ma'akva. This is a big jump. It's not a necessary jump, but the Gemara says this. If you're going to assume that the order of the hagrala of the serum is not essential, you can switch around the order and do it later, then that means this is a less significant action, which means that if you didn't do it at all, it's okay. Meaning if you chose the serum in some other way, it would be fine. They're basically saying once we lower it from its place of prominence in the beginning there, it already just lowers its significance. And then we're going to say it sounds like lo ma'akva, which again is going to go against Rabbi Yanai, who thinks that it is essential. So that's their assumption. We're now going to bring 3 possible answers. The first one we're going to reject, and then the second 2 we're going to keep. So now the Gemara says, and then they say, okay, so they say low. No, you don't have to assume that they're talking about the par inside going before the seir, the hagrala. No, you can say it's talking about something else. I'll tell you which order we think you can switch instead of that. Because remember, we did this by process of elimination. We said it couldn't be that you do number 8 before number 7. So therefore, it must be number 5 before number 2. But now we're going to say no. Okay, what does it mean? It means numbers 10 before number 7. We're going to do the matnot of the par on the altar, the blood of the par, which actually goes together with the blood of the seir on the altar, before you did actually not before number 7, before number 9. Sorry, my mistake. Before number 9. Okay? You did it before you did the seir and the hechal. Okay? The ones that are supposed to be toward the kaporet, towards the parochet, which is outside in the hechal, looking into Kodesh Kodeshim, but not in Kodesh Kodeshim. So we're basically going to say it's number 10 before number 9. Rabbi Yehuda, and then it's very simple to explain this. You could say this fits in with Rabbi Akiva. The order of 9 and 10, in other words, once you leave the Kodesh Kodeshim, let's say it in very simple terms. Once you leave Kodesh Kodeshim, the order doesn't matter. Why doesn't the order matter? Because Rabbi Yehuda, what did Rabbi Yehuda say? Go back to yesterday. Anything that's done in the white clothing outside, remember, he's still wearing the white clothing, he's still doing the special avodah Yom Kippurim, but he's outside the Kodesh Kodeshim. Anything down there isn't essential. If it's not essential, then the order's not essential either. So then that's one way to explain. What's the problem with this? Well, it doesn't match the wording of the Braita, because now we're saying that we're not talking about in the Kodesh Kodeshim, we're talking about the order of things outside the Kodesh Kodeshim. Now, what did it say in the Braita? Go back to the beginning. When it comes to the sprinklings inside the Kodesh Kodeshim. So you can't possibly say it's not talking about that. So therefore, they reject that answer. Second answer. Well, this is a very easy answer. In the last question on Rabbi Yanai, we said that Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon thinks that kapara is not ma'akev. So even Rabbi Yanai will hold. He'll hold it. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia both think it is, but Rabbi Shimon doesn't. So we can just very simply say, Haman, Elahaman, Rabbi Shimon, this source goes like Rabbi Shimon. And then we have no problem. The Braita is just Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yanai doesn't disagree. The Rabbi Shimon holds that way. He just thinks everybody else disagrees with Rabbi Shimon. Damar hagrala lo ma'akva, because he thinks hagrala is not essential, and that we clearly proved from the previous source. So that's another way to read this. Or alternatively, remember I said before we had to make this big jump? He's going to basically say maybe we don't make that big jump. How so? We're going to read it. Maybe this really does match Rabbi Yehuda. You could say, really, what if you did the sprinkling of the power of the blood inside before you did the hagrala? It's okay. but it doesn't mean Hagrala isn't essential. It just means the order isn't important, but doing it is obviously very important. So therefore, we can explain it that way. Now we're going to have a bit of an aside. We're going to stop our discussion for a minute and talk about, and it's, I should say this, I finished that line is a little bit tricky. There's a debate about what this actually is coming to do. Azdu l'ta'amai, they go according to their own approaches. Now, some people think we mean Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, who here disagree, but it doesn't really seem so likely. It seems to be going back to the previous question, which is again a little bit out of order. So there's some difficulty here. Rashi says that this is talking about Rabbi Shimon and Tanakama before. The tricky part about that is that they're going to bring a braita with Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. We'd have to say Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the Tanakama there, and that's Rabbi Yehuda. But anyway, it's a little bit tricky. I'll just kind of put it out there. But let's just assume like Rashi, that what they're going back to is the machloket about the confession. Okay, so we're kind of off topic right now. The machloket between them, is the confession essential or not essential, is we're going to see they have the same machloket somewhere else. Again, you would expect it to be Rabbi Shimon and Tanakama, it happens to be Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. So that's why it's a little tricky, because there was a Rabbi Yehuda just mentioned a minute ago. It's a little bit confusing, and there's different opinions in the commentaries how to read this section. I'm going to read according to Rashi. Azdu l'tamayu d'Tanya, as it says in the following braita. Ya'amod chai lifnei Hashem l'chaper alav. We're now going to see how they darshan this pasuk. It's talking about the seir, asher ala alav agora lazalzel, the one who gets chosen to go to Azalzel, will stand alive before God, l'chaper alav, to be atoned for, which means, now, first of all, there's a few strange things in that pasuk. First of all, what does the word l'chaper mean? L'chaper, we already had a whole discussion. Does it mean l'chaper in words, vidoy, confession? Or does it mean l'chaper, the blood, sprinkling the blood is usually atonement? And the other thing is, why does it have to say yamod chai? Why live? What, he's dead? No. And that's why does it have to say he'll stand? He'll stand. If you're standing, obviously you're alive. It didn't need to say the word alive. So what do they learn from this? Ab matai yezakuk la'amod chai. This means, and Rashi explains, al korchacha lelamdenu, the first Rashi on the page, she'im meit ata tzarich lavi acher. What this teaches you is if it dies up until a certain point in the service, you have to replace it. If it's done, the kapara, the atonement, which again, we're going to have to define what is atonement. Once the atonement part is done, if the seir were to drop dead on the floor and we never throw it off the cliff and take it out to the desert and throw it off the cliff, if we don't do that, it's okay. We don't have to replace it. That's not the essential part. So this again is getting to what is essential. So now, what ad matai yezakuk la'amod chai, until which point? Ad shat matan damo shel chavero, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Until you sprinkle the blood of the other seir, right? Remember, one goes to God and that one gets slaughtered and the blood gets sprinkled. That was all the sprinklings I was just talking about. Once the blood gets sprinkled, that's enough. The seir lazazel, if he were to drop dead right then, that would be fine. We wouldn't have to continue with the service. Okay, you wouldn't have to replace it. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ad sha'at vidoy dvarim, until you do the confession. Once the confession is done, that's your atonement. That's the critical part. What do you see here? Rabbi Shimon holds that vidoy is critical. So that matches his opinion in the machloket with Tanakama, where he said vidoy is essential. And Tanakama said, no, it's not. If you didn't do vidoy, it's okay. So therefore, we're going to say, Tanakama holds it's not the vidoy, it's the sprinkling of the blood. And Rabbi Shimon holds it's the confession. Okay, so that already is our proof. But here we're going to show what's the root of their debate. Where do they get it from? Kedetanya, it says in a different braita, lichapel. When it says lichaper in that pasuk, right, it will stand before God in order to receive atonement. Lichaper b'chaparat damim hakatuv b'taber. It's talking about blood. They quote pasuk 20. I'm not going to read it inside, but there it talks about right after the bloods were sprinkled, it says, and now they finished the atonement. So that seems pretty clear. So just like there, clearly it means you finish your atonement, and they were talking about the sprinkling of the blood. It must be the same kapara mentioned 10 psukim earlier. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda's proof that it's the sprinkling of the blood. Rabbi Shimon, what's his proof? So what do you mean? Atonement is in words. How do you get atonement? You speak, you confess your sins. That's the central part. And therefore, they each understand the word l'chaper in a different way. And that goes to explain their opinions in that braita before. Okay, again, if you assume it's coming to explain that braita before, it's the placement of this whole sugya is out of order. It should have come before the previous question, after that braita was mentioned. which is why some people think it's talking about Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda that we just talked about, but I'm not going to explain the Gemara that way. I'm going to keep going. Tashma, next source. Sha'alu Tamidav et Rabbi Akiva. Okay, now we get to the students of Rabbi Akiva. Now both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia were students of Rabbi Akiva, so we're assuming this includes both of them. Allah bismo ma'u she'achzor liyamin. This is a very strange question, but let's say, remember yesterday we talked about they always wanted to come out on the yamin, la Hashem. What if it came out on the small? Could you switch it and put, now, in fact, you're looking at me like, what are you, crazy? Why did you do the goral? Have no fear, we'll explain a little better soon. But right now it sounds like they're saying, you could just switch it. They asked him, can you do that? So now what does he say to them? His answer is even stranger than the question. Amar lahem, al titnu makom litzdukim lirodot. By the way, the censor took out the word minim. Some people have it as minim, which are heretics, instead of tzdukim. Either which way, right? It's the people who are always kind of some group of people that are always against us and trying to make issues. We don't want to give them any wiggle room to kind of have what to claim against us, right? This is a good example of, right, you have to watch your step all the time. When you have enemies against you, you got to be careful what you do. So he says, don't do that. And what does that mean? Theoretically, you could, but don't do it because it'll give room for people to take issue with us. So Tama, the reason he says it is to al tidnu makom l'tzdukim l'radot. Halav hachi, if not, ma'adrin alahu. It sounds like you can undo the goral. Now, obviously, if you can undo the goral, ha'amart, hagrala ma'akva, v'kevan dekavitu b'smol, hechi ma'adrin aleh. If the hagrala is so central, then you can't possibly switch it around and undo it. So again, assuming students of Rabbi Akiva are, right, and they must hold like Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia are students of his, they must hold like him, and he seems to clearly say, it's no problem to undo the goral, which means it's obviously not significant. So Amar Rava, he said, no, you obviously misunderstood this. And here I'll explain it. This is really what they said, not what you thought. Okay, I know you thought this was crazy. Let's explain it in a better way. Allah goral b'smol, ma'u she'achziru lo u'lesi'iro liyamin. If the goral comes out in your left hand, so what's the Kohen supposed to do? The one on his left becomes the goral Hashem, and the one on the right becomes the Shiur Lazalzeh. So now, what if he wants everything to be on the right hand? So he takes the goral, before he places on the animal, he switches it to his right hand. And then he takes the seirim and he swaps them. And he moves the one on the right to the one to be on the left, and the one on the left to be on the right. And so he's not switching any goral, he's just switching which side they happen to be standing. That's a whole different question. That has nothing to do, you're not messing up any goral that was done, and then this has nothing to do with our topic, and therefore it doesn't raise a question against Rabbi Yana. And then what does he say? So can you move that and the seir to yad yamin? Amar lahem al tidnu makom l'tzdukim l'radot, and he says, don't start futzing around. It's just going to give them reason to to kind of mock our service. So keep it as is. Yes, we'd rather it be on the right, but you'll live without it being on the right. By the way, you see, how crazy this right was, right? To us, like right, left is not as significant. To them, it was very, very central, especially in the temple, where everybody had to do everything with their right hand as long as they could. There's clearly this importance of the right. Now we're going to bring a source to we brought a lot of sources to go against Rabbi Yanai. Now we're going to try to prove Rabbi Yanai. Tashma, ilu ne'emar et ha'se'ir asher alav. If it had said in the verse, et ha'se'ir asher alav, the se'ir that, right, what does it say? The se'ir that Allah alav ha'goral, that the goral was lifted, right, or was that fell on him. Okay, so it says asher Allah alav. So if it had said asir asher alav without the word Allah, then hayiti omer yanichenu alav. You would say that asir asher alav means you have to put it on there. Talmud lomar Allah kevan she'Allah shuvino tzarich. You might have thought that it was very important to place the lots on the animal, but no, it says Allah alav. Allah comes to say, right, that the lottery fell on it, means the coin took it out. This one was the right, this one was the left, that position. The halacha is not important. The word Allah comes to teach you that. So now they're going to try to explain and prove from here that hagrala is essential. Limai. For what are they referring to? When does it say asher Allah, you don't have to do anything more? If you want to say the Allah of doing the hagrala is just a mitzvah, but if you didn't do it, it's okay. Then it's clear that you don't even have to do hanacha at all. It's not even a mitzvah. It's not even important. And therefore, elalav la'akev, it must be telling you, so if it's trying to tell you that Allah, the goral, the pulling, the drawing the lots is a mitzvah, but not essential. And then the hanacha, you don't even have to do it all. That's clearly not what it's saying. Then you wouldn't have a law of hanacha. And as whatever you do for hagrala, it's going to be one less for hanacha. That's what this source is telling you. So it must mean hagrala is ma'akevet. Hanacha is a mitzvah, but it's not essential. That's what we must be learning from here. And we're not learning, you don't have to do hanacha at all, right? That's what you would learn if you would think that the hagrala is not ma'akevet, then you would drop one level. Hanacha, you wouldn't even have to do it all. And therefore, shma mina hagrala ma'akevet, hanacha lo ma'akevet. This seems to prove Rabbi Yana. Hanacha is essential. Hagrala is, hanacha is not. But Amarava, he's going to explain it differently. Hachi kamar. This is the way it should read. Ilu ne'emar asher alav, hayiti omer yenichenu alav ad shat shchita. If it had just said asher alav, you would think that you not only need to place it, but you need to leave it on the animal, that little piece of the lot, leave it on there until the time where it's slaughtered. Remember, you don't slaughter the animal right now. You go back to the par. He does the confession. He does the sprinkling, the slaughtering of the bull. He does the sprinkling of the blood of the bull in the Kodesh Kodeshim, and only then does he slaughter the seer. So maybe you'd think you'd have to leave the lot on the animal all that time. Talmud Loma, Asher Allah, Kevan Shala Shuveno Tzarich. When it means Allah is, since you did the goral already, you don't need to leave it on the seer until Shat Shchita. You just need to place it. You don't need to leave it there. In which case, this doesn't teach you anything about whether hagrala is ma'akev or not. Now we're going to get to our last and final source for today, Tashma, where we're going to actually definitively conclude that Rabbi Yana in the second language, the second lashon, is correct. That in the end, we're going to say hagrala is ma'akva, according to both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Vasau chatat. Okay, the end of that verse that we just said, Asher Allah alav goral, then you make it a chatat. So why do you need those words? It's to teach you hagoral oseu chatat ve'en Hashem oseu chatat. It's to teach you, now what does this mean? The only way to determine which animal goes where is goral and not by calling it by name. Now they're going to say, why do you need a drasha for that? Shecho valodinu, right? Why do you need the words vasau chatat teach that? Isn't it obvious that you do it by goral and not, it's as Caroline asked before. What do you mean? It says in the Torah, you do it by goral. Well, how else are you going to do it? So they say valodinu, it's actually a kavachomer, you could learn it. Where else do we determine two animals or two, we're going to see two birds that go one for one korban and one for the other? We learn it from these pairs of birds, kinim. There's homosech kinim about this. Pairs of birds for a zav, a zavad. We'll talk about it tomorrow more. There's a metzora who doesn't have enough money. Instead of the animal, he can bring two birds. If you have the korban levi ored, you're supposed to bring a sin offering. Instead of bringing one sin offering of an animal, if you're poor, you bring two bird offerings. But now, instead of one chatat, this is going to be very important for tomorrow, you're going to end up with two birds. One is a burnt offering and one is a sin offering. Okay, out of one chatat comes, right, instead of one animal chatat, you end up with two different kinds of sacrifices. Now, at what point, how do you determine which goes for which? Tomorrow we'll learn at what point, but how do you learn? How do you determine? You call it by name. You say, this is olah, this is chatat. So, ma b'makom shelo kidesh hagoral. Now, you can't do it by a lottery. If you do, you can, but it's not effective. What we're going to talk about tomorrow is, what if after you determined it, can it be changed? So the point is, at certain points or by certain people in certain ways, it can't be changed. If you did it by goral, you could theoretically, but anyone can change it after that, because it doesn't work there. Now, if the goral doesn't work, we're now going to say it's less effective, it has less capabilities, and yet Kidesh Hashem, but calling it by name would work, then Makom Shekidesh HaGoral, in our case, there's more possibilities, because you can even use a goral, and a goral determines. You can't change it once it's determined. So Eino Din Shekadesh Hashem. So wouldn't you think that calling it by name would also work? Again, one could question the logic here, but like most kavachomers, logic could be questioned, but that's the logic. Talmud Lomal Vasau Chatat. Therefore, the drasha comes to teach you, no, by name it doesn't work. HaGoral oseh chatat ve'en Hashem oseh chatat. The goral does it, not calling it by name. Now, why does this prove anything? You could say this is Rabbi Shimon, but no, This is a Midrash Halacha called Sifra, which is the Midrash Halacha and Sefer Vayikra. And Stam Sifra Mane, it's known that Sifra is attributed to who's the author of the Sifra? Rabbi Yehuda. And that's right. And this teaches you Goral is Ma'akev, it's essential. The Goral is what determines, and not calling it by name, which obviously means Goral is essential. So Alma Hagrala Me'akva and Tiyuvta demand Amar Hagrala Lo Ma'akva. So they finish and they say Hagrala is clearly essential, and it raises a question against Rabbi Yochanan, who thinks that he said Rabbi Yehuda holds Hagrala is not essential, and it's a Tiyuvta, which means we don't have an answer to that question. That will finish for today, and tomorrow is going to start with this Braita using in a different context to question something Rav Chisda says, and we're going to get totally off topic for a little while till we get back to the next Mishnah, which is going to bring us back to the Avodah of Yom Kippurim. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone.